Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on one of the rarest and somewhat strangest Japanese experimental weapon that was developed before and tested during the early days of the Russo-Japanese War, or the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. And this weapon here is kind of surprising, as you don't really see many early Japanese automatic weapon projects from the late 19th and early 20th century. And that weapon is the Hino-Kamuro rifle from 1904. This was a rare Japanese experimental semi-automatic rifle that was developed by a somewhat well-known Japanese inventor by the name of Komuro Hino between the years 1900 and 1904. It was actually one of two experimental rifles that were tested by the Empire of Japan before the Russo-Japanese War, with the first prototype being developed in 1897. Now, the Hino-Kamuro was a rare blow-forward semi-automatic rifle project by Komuro Hino, developed between 1900 and 1904. It was chambered for the standard 6.5 by 50mm Arisaka cartridge that was already being used in the Arisaka Type 30 bolt-action rifle. This weapon was fed by a detachable box magazine that held anywhere from 10 to 15 rounds. And this is a rare blow-forward semi-automatic rifle where the charging handle was located in front of both the receiver and magazine well and trigger. The Hino-Kamuro model 1904 was actually the second semi-automatic rifle project developed by Komuro Hino. Komuro Hino is known for developing one of Japan's first semi-automatic pistols, the Hino-Kamuro M1908, which was a semi-automatic pistol that actually competed with the Nambu Type 14 semi-automatic pistol that would become the standard pistol of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. That pistol was rejected because it could not handle the 8x22mm Nambu cartridge, although there were some 8mm variants made later on in 1912. Now, going all the way back to 1904, Komuro Hino actually submitted his semi-automatic blow-forward semi-automatic rifle to the Imperial Japanese Army for testing. Now, it was actually tested in front of the Japanese emperor of the time, Emperor Meiji, and his son, Emperor Taijo, who would later become the Emperor of Japan after Meiji's death in, I think, 1912. Now, according to a German report, the weapon either failed the test or the emperor simply wasn't impressed with the rifle, and the rifle was rejected by the Empire of Japan, by the Imperial Japanese Army. And 1 year later, in 1905, the Imperial Japanese Army would adopt the Type 38, a bolt-action Arisaka rifle that was pretty much just a slightly updated Type 30 Arisaka rifle. Now, Komuro Hino had already developed a semi-automatic rifle that was tested by the Imperial Japanese Army earlier in 1897. That rifle was based mostly on the Arisaka Type 30 rifle, but was a semi-automatic blow-forward rifle also, and it also had the charging handle in front of both the trigger and barrel. That weapon was fed by a 5-round internal magazine, and it was fed by the same stripper clips as the Type 30 bolt-action rifle. And just like the model 1904, it too was rejected, hence why Komuro Hino later went into developing semi-automatic pistols instead. Now, the model 1908 pistol was used in limited numbers by the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy and Air Force. Only about 1,200 were made between 1908 and I believe 1912. Hino-Kamuro would go on to develop even more weapons, experimental weapons, in the 1910s and 20s, but neither of those were ever adopted. Now, Hino-Kamuro didn't go into this alone. He actually had a partner by the name of Tomojiro Komuro, hence the name Hino-Kamuro. Hino being Komuro Hino's name, and Komuro being Tomojiro Komuro's name. Now, Komuro was actually an acquaintance or friend of Komuro Hino, but he was also a financial investor. He actually invested in many of the weapons projects that Hino-Kamuro came up with. And in fact, they went on to found a small manufacturing firm that manufactured the Hino-Kamuro pistols, known as the Komuro Juho Sai Sakusho, which was a small Japanese arms manufacturing firm, but their only product was really just semi-automatic handguns and copies of some Western guns, mostly handguns and shotguns. Funny enough, fast forward to the year 1941, Hino-Kamuro was still developing rare experimental rifles and also even some aircraft, as he was also an aeronautical or aviation engineer. he had developed a number of experimental planes before and after the Hino-Kamuro rifles. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army was actually looking for a semi-automatic rifle to compete with the American M1 Garand. And Komuro Hino actually brought back the model 1904 and offered it again for the second time. He even offered to make a new prototype. And he actually did, according to some records, make a second, a third, or fourth semi-automatic rifle between the years 1941 and 1943. But in 1944 and 1945, the city of Tokyo, in which Komuro Hino was living at the time, was bombed by the Americans during the war, and as a result, Komuro Hino's house and his firearm firm were all burned and destroyed during the bombings of Tokyo between 1944 and 1945. As a result, Komuro Hino was actually homeless for a bit after the war and eventually died in 1946 from malnutrition. So kind of a sad end to one of Japan's somewhat known inventors from the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, going back to the Hino-Kamuro model 1904, this was a pretty advanced rifle at the time. Now, this weapon had a very strange action, as I mentioned. This is a blow-forward weapon. In fact, there were only a small number of blow-forward action arms or firearms made in history. And this is one of the few rifles that were manufactured to have a blow-forward system. Now, the system or action that this weapon here has a movable forward barrel, as in the barrel is actually somewhat loose and is held together by a return spring that is in place in the bed of the rifle. The weapon was chambered for the 6.5mm cartridge, keep in mind. Now, when you fire the weapon or you squeeze the trigger, the barrel actually moved forward and stood on a ledge located inside the rifle stock. This allowed the second cartridge to come up from the magazine, and when the barrel would go back, it would lock on to this cartridge, thus loading the second cartridge and ejecting the spent cartridge. Now keep in mind when the barrel is doing this, it is actually breaking away from the sear located inside the rifle. The barrel broke away from the sear, moving backward, which sent the next cartridge into the chamber. It is a very strange blow-forward weapon. There's only a handful of weapons that I can think of that have the same action as this. Weapons like the Austrian Steyr Mannlicher Model 1894, which was a blow-forward semi-automatic pistol, or the German Swirlos Model 1908, which was a German-Austrian semi-automatic handgun. If you want to go closer to a rifle, the German HIW Volkssturm Karabiner Model 1944, which was a rare semi-automatic blow-forward rifle developed by the Germans at the end of World War II in late 1944. Those are some examples of blow-fired weapons. In fact, Ian McCollin from Forgotten Weapons actually tested the German Swirlos Model 1908 pistol, so you can actually see how the blow-forward function works. This rifle pretty much used the same system, but on a rifle instead of a handgun. In fact, the Hino-Kamuro Model 1908 pistol was also a blow-forward firearm. So this is one of only two blow-forward rifles ever developed, with the second one being the German Volkssturm Karabiner from 1944. So yeah, this is a pretty rare action, and it would have been cool if the Japanese had adopted this weapon. Just imagine an alternate scenario where the Empire of Japan adopts the Hino-Kamuro rifle instead of the Type 38 bolt-action rifle. You would have Japanese soldiers in World War I with a semi-automatic rifle. And also keep in mind, this weapon was developed during the early days of the Russo-Japanese War, which also happened in 1904. The Russo-Japanese War broke out in February 1904 and lasted until 1905. So Japan could have adopted a semi-automatic rifle in the middle of the Russo-Japanese War and could have had some of these rifles on the front line by the end of the conflict. They would also have a semi-automatic rifle as standard issued by World War I. Remember, in our real-world timeline, the Japanese had the Type 38 rifle, the Type 30 and Type 38 rifles, and the Type 44 carbine by World War I. Now imagine an alternate World War II. Imagine an alternate World War II where Japanese soldiers have a standard semi-automatic rifle like this Hino-Kamuro 1904 instead of the Arisaka Type 30, Type 38, Type 44, or later the Type 99 series of bolt-action rifles. Japan would have had the equivalent of an M1 Garand by the end of the Russo-Japanese War. They would have had an M1 Garand or a Soviet SVT-40 equivalent by the beginning of World War I and as standard issued throughout World War II. This weapon here could have changed the history of the First World War and Second World War for the Empire of Japan. Now, Japan actually did win on their front in World War I, but they could have expanded even more if they had a standard semi-automatic rifle like this Hino-Kamuro model 1904. So this here was a pretty advanced weapon concept for the time, but ultimately it was either rejected because it failed a test, or it just didn't impress the Japanese emperor or the Imperial Japanese Army leadership. And ultimately the weapon was cancelled by the end of 1904, early 1905, thus ending the history and potential of one of Japan's first semi-automatic rifle projects developed by Hino-Kamuro or Kamado-Hino between 1900 and 1904. So what do you all think of this? A rare Japanese semi-automatic rifle project, the Hino-Kamuro model 1904, a rare semi-automatic rifle that actually could have changed the Japanese military history, especially during the Second World War. From the Russo-Japanese War, I might add. This is a Russo-Japanese War era weapon. It was developed during the beginning of that conflict. So what do you all think of this? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was a J-Man Time, signing off.